The groom had not even waited for her to set down her bag. Millicent Dare stood on the depot platform in Junction Wells with the afternoon sun hard on her face and her traveling trunk at her feet, and the particular hollow feeling of a woman whose plans have come apart all at once. The man who was supposed to have been her husband, a Mr. Chester Foy, owner of a dry goods concern on Main Street, had taken one look at her stepping off the train, said she was not as described, and told the station master she'd need to get herself back on the eastbound. He had not spoken to her directly. He had looked at her and then past her, and he had said it to the station master as though she were a shipment of flour that had arrived in the wrong grade. Then he had straightened his jacket and walked away down the platform without a backward glance, a man who'd disposed of an inconvenience and had other things to get to. The station master had the grace to look embarrassed. He told her the eastbound came through on Thursdays. This was Tuesday. She stood on that platform with the other passengers flowing around her and the train hissing behind her, and she considered her situation, $32 in her purse, which was what remained after the train fare from St. Louis, 2 days until Thursday. The single hotel in Junction Wells charged 75 cents a night, which she could manage, though it would leave her with almost nothing by the time she reached her sister in Cheyenne, who she'd written to but hadn't heard back from, and who might or might not be in a position to help. She was not, she told herself firmly, going to cry on this platform. She was not going to give Chester Foy the satisfaction, even though he was already gone and would never see it. She picked up her bag and left the trunk where it was. The station master said he'd keep it, and walked toward the town of Junction Wells to see what could be managed. What could be managed turned out to be a room at the hotel, at $1.25 she hadn't budgeted for, and a meal at the counter of the small restaurant next door, and the news from the woman who ran it. Her name was Dora, a compact woman of about 50 with efficient movements and knowing eyes, that Chester Foy had, in fact, been engaged twice before. One woman had arrived and then left within a week. Another had simply refused to come. The details weren't entirely clear, Dora said, but the pattern was. Millicent ate her supper quietly and filed this information away. She was a woman who had learned early that other people's information, gathered without fuss, was often more useful than anything you came in carrying. She was on the hotel porch the next morning, writing a letter to her sister, when the cattle arrived. They came in from the south, maybe 200 head of longhorns with the red dust of the trail still thick on them, and behind them half a dozen drovers in various states of tiredness, the kind of tiredness that lives in the shoulders and the eyes and the particular angle at which a man sits his horse when the work has been long. They drove the cattle toward the holding pens at the edge of town, and the noise and the dust took over Junction Wells for the better part of an hour, two of the younger hands having considerable trouble with a group of steers who took a sudden interest in the livery stable's open door. The man who rode at the back of the column was not the one she noticed first. She noticed the chaos at the front and the young hands cursing in language she pretended not to hear. The man at the back was simply there, steady and unhurried, closing any gap that opened, nudging a stray animal back into line with a quiet word and a slight shift of his horse's shoulder, all of it accomplished without drama or apparent effort. He was perhaps 40, broad through the chest, with a duster that had seen considerable weather and a hat that was neither new nor shapeless, but somewhere between the two that spoke of a thing kept because it worked. He had a jaw that looked like it had been decided on, and a way of holding still on a horse that Millicent associated with men who didn't need to prove anything to anyone, least of all themselves. He caught her looking from the porch and touched his hat, and she looked away. She was at the restaurant counter an hour later when he came in and sat 2 stools down. Dora greeted him as Hank and asked about the drive and brought him coffee without being asked. He drank his coffee and ate his eggs and did not speak unnecessarily, which Millicent found restful. She was eating her own eggs and thinking about $32 and the Thursday train and her sister's unanswered letter and what she was going to do with herself. Dora, who had the quality some women have of being exactly as interested in other people's business as the situation required and no more, set down the coffee pot and said conversationally that the woman 2 stools over was the one Chester Foy had sent back yesterday. Millicent put down her fork. Hank turned his head and looked at her, and she looked back at him steadily, because whatever she was not someone who looked away from her own situation out of embarrassment. He said, without particular warmth but without unkindness, "Sent you back like freight?" She said, like freight he'd ordered by mistake, "Yes." He was quiet a moment. He said, what was his objection? She said she hadn't received a full accounting. He'd said she was not as described, which she supposed was his way of saying he'd expected something other than what he got. Hank looked at her for a long moment with direct grey eyes. He said, what had he been led to expect? She considered this carefully. She said she supposed he'd expected a woman who would be grateful enough for the arrangement to overlook anything that needed overlooking. She said she was a grateful woman in general, but had perhaps not looked, when she stepped off that train, like someone who would overlook a great deal. Something shifted in his expression. It was not quite a smile. It was the thing that happens to a face just before a smile, when the decision hasn't been made yet. He went back to his eggs, she went back to hers. He came to find her on the hotel porch in the afternoon. He held his hat in his hand, which she noted, because a man who takes his hat off when he comes to a woman is a man who was raised to show respect and hasn't unlearned it. He said that Dora had told him she was waiting on the Thursday eastbound. She said that was correct. He said he had a small ranch 4 miles outside of Junction Wells, that he'd been driving cattle for other men's operations for 6 years to save the money to build it up, and that he had a house in good repair, but no woman in it and no prospect of one, and that he would like to propose a different arrangement than the Thursday train if she would hear him out. She looked at him. She said she was listening. He was direct, and she appreciated it more than she would have appreciated fine words. He said he was not a romantic man and would not pretend to be. He said the work was real and the winters were hard and the house was not large. He said he would treat her decently and work beside her, and not raise his hand to her, and that what she chose to make of the arrangement beyond those basics was up to the both of them as time went on. He said if she found in 6 months that she wanted to be somewhere else, he would help her get there without recrimination. She said, why me? He said because she'd looked Chester Foy's stationmaster in the eye and not collapsed, and because the way she'd talked just now told him she was honest, and he had been lied to enough in the preceding years that honesty was what he valued most in a person. She thought about $32. She thought about her sister's unanswered letter. She thought about Thursday and the long train back east and what waited there. Then she stopped thinking about those things, because she was also thinking about the way he'd sat at the back of that cattle column, closing every gap without making a show of it, and about the fact that he was standing in front of her with his hat in his hand. She said she had conditions. He said he expected so. She said she would run the household as she saw fit, without interference. She said she would not be treated as an employee or a convenience, and if he had notions about a wife's proper station, he should hear now that her notions differed. She said she would work hard and expected the same in return, and that she would not remain if the work was all on one side. He said those terms were fair. She said, one more thing. She would not be sent back. Not ever, not for any reason, and if there came a point at which the arrangement was no longer working, they would discuss it like 2 adults and reach an agreement. But she would not be returned anywhere like something that hadn't satisfied. He was very still for a moment. Then he said, you won't be. I don't work that way. She looked at him for a long time. He looked back. She said, "All right then," and she said yes. They were married that afternoon by the circuit preacher who happened to be in Junction Wells, which Millicent took as either an omen or a coincidence, and she decided it didn't much matter which. Dora served as witness, and the station master who'd stood embarrassed on the platform stood as the second, and when it was done he shook Hank's hand and told Millicent he was glad for her, which she believed. Chester Foy saw them coming out of the preacher's house. He stopped in the middle of the street and stared. Millicent met his eyes and held them for exactly the count of 5, which was enough, and then she looked back at Hank and walked on without another glance. Hank's ranch was, as he'd described, structurally sound, unadorned, and in need of a woman's attention in the way houses get when a man has been pouring all his care into other things. She walked through it that first evening while he tended the horses, noting what needed doing first and what could wait. The bedroom was small and the parlor was smaller, and the root cellar needed new shelving, but the beams were solid overhead, and there were no gaps in the walls where the cold could find a way through, which mattered more than most things come November. The kitchen was the best room, a good stove with a warming shelf, a deep sink with a hand pump that worked, and wide windows that caught the morning light. She stood at those windows and looked at the land spreading out to the west, the grass going gold in the last of the day, and she thought, well, this is where I am. She was not a woman who needed things to be perfect before she could inhabit them. She was a woman who needed things to be possible, and this was possible. He made supper, beans and salt pork and cornbread that was better than she'd expected from a bachelor's kitchen, the edges crisped just right, and they ate together at the table without much talking, because they were two people who had just made a large decision, and there was a quality of settling in that happened in silence rather than words. He washed the plates and she dried them, which reversed what she'd expected, and when they put out the lamp she lay in the narrow dark and thought about how the day had begun and how it had ended, and she found she was not frightened. Surprised, but not frightened, and that seemed, given the circumstances, like as good a beginning as anyone could reasonably ask for. She took stock of what the house needed and began with the kitchen, because the kitchen is the heart of a house, and if the heart is right the rest can be fixed in time. She caulked the cold corner of the window frame with clay and rags. She reorganized the pantry shelves so that the things used daily were at hand and the things used rarely were up high. She found, in the bottom of a crate he'd never unpacked, a set of dishes her mother's generation would have called nice, wrapped in newspaper from 3 years ago, and she washed them and put them up and said nothing about it, because a man's unpacked crate was a man's own business. Though she suspected she knew why he'd packed them and not found a reason to unpack them yet, and she was glad he had them now. The weeks showed her the shape of him. He was a man of few words, but those words were always useful. He rose before dawn and worked until dark, and never once suggested that the work inside was lesser than the work outside. When a neighbor's dog got at the hen house and she lost 4 birds, he came home to find her cleaning up the damage and went out without comment and came back an hour later with 4 replacement hens in a crate from the farm 2 miles south, the trading already done. He set the crate down and said only that the wire on the east side of the henhouse had a weak spot she might want him to fix on Saturday. She said she'd already fixed it herself. He looked at the work, nodded once, and said it looked solid. When the north fence blew down in a November storm, he asked her opinion on where to run the new line, and he listened when she answered and ran it where she said, which turned out to be the right place. When she said she wanted to put in a kitchen garden in the spring, he spent 2 evenings of November reading her seed catalogue with her, asking careful questions about what grew well in this soil, in a way that told her he was genuinely interested and not merely tolerating her plans. He brought her things without announcement, a better lantern, a bolt of blue wool she'd admired in the Junction Wells window, an almanac, 'cause she'd mentioned once that she liked to know what was coming. He set these things down and didn't make speeches about them. She found she was watching for him in the evenings, the sound of his horse on the road before she could see him. She found she was glad when he came in. More than glad, she found, somewhere around the third week of October, that the house felt different in his absence than it felt in the evenings, and that the evenings were what she worked toward now. The trouble came in December, when Chester Foy stopped Hank on the road to town and told him that Millicent had misrepresented herself to the matrimonial agency, that she'd claimed skills she didn't have, that she'd said she was younger than she was, that Hank had been taken in by a woman who'd deceived her way into a decent arrangement. Foy had said it in front of 2 other men from town, because Chester Foy was the kind of man who preferred witnesses to his meanness. Hank came home that evening, and she could see by the set of his jaw that something had happened. She asked him what it was, and he told her, because he was a direct man. She set down the dish she was drying. She said, "Is there anything he told you that you didn't know about me already?" He thought about it. He said, "No." She said, "And has anything I've told you about myself been untrue?" He said, "No." She said, "Then there's nothing to decide." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I didn't come home to decide anything. I came home because I wanted you to know what he'd said, not to have it come to you from someone else." She understood then that he'd told her as a courtesy, not a question, that the deciding had already been done, and it was not a close thing. Something warm and solid settled in her chest. She said, "He's a petty man with a grudge against himself." Hank said, "That's the most words I've heard you put together on one subject." She said, "He deserves every one of them." He almost smiled then, fully this time, the smile arriving and staying, and she had not seen it before in full. It changed his face entirely, added years of warmth that the rest of him kept hidden away, and she thought, "There you are. There is the man underneath all that steadiness." She found herself smiling back before she'd decided to. He went to Chester Foy in January, which she heard about from Dora over the counter. He'd gone into the dry goods store and told Foy quietly, in front of whoever happened to be present, that if he heard another word casting doubt on his wife's character, the matter would require further discussion. He had said it very quietly, Dora said, which made it considerably more effective than shouting would have been. Chester Foy had not said another word. By February the house had been remade in the ways that mattered, not by grand gesture, but by the accumulation of daily choosing. Her herbs on the kitchen shelf, his chair by the fire and hers across from it, the pattern settled without discussion. The evenings when they read by lamplight, or when she talked and he listened with his full attention, or when he told her, in pieces about the drives and the years before the ranch, and she learned the shape of him from the inside as well as the outside. On a February evening, the snow falling soft and straight past the kitchen window, he set down his book and looked at her and said she had not run. She said she hadn't planned to. He said, "I knew on that platform. I didn't know how to say it without it sounding foolish." She said it didn't sound foolish. He said, "I'm glad you stayed." She looked at him across the lamplight, this quiet, steady man who had come to her, with his hat in his hand and his terms laid plain and his word kept in every particular since. She felt the warmth of it settle into her bones. She said, "I'm glad I stayed too." He reached across the table and took her hand. Just that her hand in his, the fire crackling, the snow at the window, the ranch around them quiet and whole. And Millicent Dare, who had stood on a train platform 2 days after Christmas with $32 and a hollow feeling and the specific humiliation of being returned like unwanted freight, found that she had, in the most unlikely Tuesday afternoon of her life, found exactly what she'd been traveling toward. Better than she'd planned, better even than she'd been able to hope.